Well, welcome everybody, and good morning. It's if you don't mind the temperature out there, it's a gorgeous day. Welcome to the Rockefeller Institute of Government. I'm Tom Gaze. I'm director of the institute, and I'm delighted to have you here at one of our public forums. Today's topic is election law reform, with an emphasis on voter participation. Woody Allen once said, 80% of success is simply showing up. Well, a lot of New York voters actually don't, unfortunately. And in fact, New York is has one of the lowest voter participation rates in the country. One study just a couple of years ago found that New York was 46th in terms of voter turnout in the U.S. compared to other states, including the District of Columbia. We were far behind leaders like Minnesota, Wisconsin, New Hampshire, and we were even behind Arkansas, but we were just ahead of Oklahoma. So there are those that are even behind us. Now that wouldn't be so bad being low in the totem pole in the United States compared to other states if the U.S. overall was great in terms of voter participation, but we aren't doing well on that score either. There was a report by the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance back about a decade ago, looked at average voter participation rates in 169 nations. They found the United States down around 138th. So there's a long way to go to try to get our voter participation up. That's important, of course, because voting is one of the most important rights that is widely distributed in the United States. The one source of political power that at least potentially is broadly available to citizens. If only a small part and a disproportionate part of the citizenry is actually exercising that right, then that affects our politics. And it affects who gets heard, and it affects even our governance. People who do vote tend to be different. They tend to be older. They tend to be more educated. They tend to have higher income, and that could affect the kinds of issues that are presented to the government. It can even affect the dynamics of our institutions. I think it's fair to say that the differences in the electorates between on-year and off-year elections at the national level is one of the sources of division in our national government. So anyway, it's an important issue and a critical issue, especially in New York State. And fortunately, today we have a wonderful panel to talk about it, people who are dealing with this issue practically and in a serious manner. But before the discussion begins, I'd really like to thank the League of Women Voters in New York State for their participation, for their co-sponsoring this event. And I'd especially like to take note of Laura Ladd-Bierman. Where's Laura? Right there. Laura, thank you very much for working with us. I don't know if you'd want to add anything, or okay, very good. So we can get on. So now it's my pleasure to turn it over to the News and Public Affairs Director of WCNY and the host of the Capitol Newsroom, Susan Arbetter. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you very much. This topic couldn't be more relevant as every seat in the state legislature is up for re-election this year, as are the 3 statewide elected seats. And if we don't reform the state's election laws in time for this November, well, maybe we'll get it done in time for November 2016, where I hear that there's another pretty big election coming up then. Unfortunately, if history is any guide, we're going to need a while to change the state's cumbersome election laws. Why do I call them cumbersome? Because I'm being really nice. A better word would be anachronistic. It's easier to plan an around-the-world trip on an iPad than it is to cast your vote early in New York. And if you want to cast an absentee ballot in New York State, you better have a damn good excuse. 33 states plus the District of Columbia offer some sort of early voting. Louisiana does, Texas does. States including Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, North Carolina, bastions of progressive thinking, offer both early voting and no excuse absentee balloting or voting. New York, none of the above. Election modernization can take many forms. Early voting is just one. Others include automatic voter registration, standardized poll worker training, better ballot design. Today we're going to hear from about the pros and cons around many of these ideas and others that I haven't thought of, and discuss how to pay for them all, which is, of course, a critical issue, with a great panel of experts. This just in, Senator Tom O'Mara, chair of the Senate Election Committee, and a resident of Big Flats, New York. It's great to see you. Next to him, we have Assemblyman Michael Cusick, who's chair of the Assembly Election Committee. He's a son of Staten Island. Thank you for being here, Assemblyman. Thank you. Tom Wilkie is former executive director of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission and former executive director of the New York State Board of Elections, and hails from a variety of places, including Buffalo, Albany, and D.C. And Dan Kolb is co-chair of the New York State Bar Association Special Committee on Voter Participation, and he hails from Cleveland, but he's here now, and that's all that counts. We're going to hear from each of the panelists for a few minutes, then we're going to open up the conversation to a discussion where everybody can participate, because that's what this is all about. Why don't we begin with Senator O'Mara?
Yeah, just thank you, Mike. That's not necessary.
Bipartisanship.
Bipartisanship. Absolutely. Is this on? Can you all? Okay. Well, good morning. I'm sorry I'm a few minutes late, but believe it or not, on this date, I actually had to drive through some snow squalls that slowed me down a little bit, down around Binghamton and then between Oneonta and Cobleskill. So there's still lake effect out there, even that far away from the lakes, which is unfortunate for this time in March. But it's my pleasure to be here this morning, and I want to thank the Institute and the League of Women Voters for putting this on and asking me to be here. And I really look forward to your questions and the dialogue we have about some of these very important issues before us today. I think one of the biggest issue we have with elections in this state and in this country is just having an involved electorate, having an electorate that is paying attention to the issues, and getting them registered to vote is certainly a key priority of that. And I think our schools and education system kind of dropped the ball on that to some extent, when they really should be encouraging our younger citizens that are approaching the age of 18 to get involved, to pay attention, to register to vote, and to really follow the elections. Because it's one thing to register everybody to vote and get them all to turn out to vote, but if we're having people come out to vote that don't know anything about the candidates and what they're voting for, then I don't see how that betters our process at all. So I think the larger concern for me with these issues is the registration issues and the issues of getting citizens to pay attention, to be involved in the process, to think that their vote counts. And we've seen certainly many elections that come down to recounts, very close elections, and I think making that known to particularly younger voters that their vote does make a difference will have an impact on getting these voters to pay attention to who they're voting for and to make an informed decision when they do go out to vote, and encouraging them to vote. I am, on some of the particular issues that we'll hear about today on our agenda that we have to talk about, early voting, I think, being one of the bigger ones that we talk about. I'm not a fan of early voting for a few reasons. I think the expense doesn't seem to be justified by the reports and studies I've seen that show a significant enough increase in participation to do that, to justify that cost, and also have concerns over the someone voting early and then a change in circumstances between the day they cast their vote and election day, which I think voting, while voting and being registered to vote and voting is certainly a right that we all have under our Constitution, but we have the duty to exercise that right and do it in an informed manner and do it. I think Election Day should be a priority for everyone to come together and vote, and I think the longer we spread it out, the more that it will dilute interest and some of the hype that builds around Election Day, that really builds interest in the overall election. And I think from what I've seen from the various literature that I've read, that the increase in turnout as a result of early voting does not justify the expense. Particularly, I come from a district in the southern tier of New York and the Finger Lakes region. I have several small cities in the district, some suburban areas, and a lot of rural areas. So there's a whole difference in who votes and how they vote and when they vote and where they vote. But I've never heard much of an issue, at least where I come from, that it's too much of a burden to get to the polls on Election Day. That's not an excuse I hear from people about reasons for not being involved in the process. And with that, I'll turn it over to our next speaker. And again, thank you all for having me here today.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. Thank you so much. I want to also thank the Institute and the League of Women Voters for having this forum. This is it was graciously said that this was a panel of experts. I think there might be 3 experts here. I'll never pretend. I don't pretend to be an expert. The senator is saying 2 experts. So
We're down to 1.
I just wanted to say that these forums are very important because we, Senator O'Mara and I, this is how we gather up information. This is how, I know the senator from his days in the Assembly. We served together in the Assembly, and he does a great job as the election law chair in the Senate. And a lot of that has to do with listening. And I've learned at a young age, my parents were in public service, that listening is the most important part of your job when you're in public service. And knowing what's out there and what may be new to you is very important, and having an open mind on those things. I just want to say that when I was appointed the chair of election law a few years back, one of the reasons why I was very excited in taking the position is that in my political career, I started off in the Young Democrats back, now 20 some odd years ago. But one of the big things, and it always seems to be a big issue now, is registering people to vote and getting people involved in the process. And that is what my goal as chair has always been, is to find new ways to encourage people to vote. I've been in office now 12 years, and Senator O'Mara will attest to this, and my colleague, Assemblyman Kavanaugh, is in the back. He'll attest to this also. You get a lot of people who complain. That's part of the job. I get that. But I've gotten to the point now that I carry in my district, or who's ever with me, carries voter registration forms with us, because when somebody's getting a little in your face and the first question I'll ask them is, are you registered to vote? And I got to tell you, 8 out of 10 times the answer is no. And I'll say to them, well, quite frankly, you have no right to complain. If you vote, you can vote against me, you can vote for me, but you gave up any right to complain about this by not voting. And, I'd like to say that every one of those folks registered right there, but that wouldn't be true. and that every conversation went very smoothly, but that wouldn't be true either. But that's how important it is, and people have to realize that if this is your voice. The opportunity to vote is literally your voice, and so that has been what I've been trying to do as chair of the Assembly election law. You know, I know we're going to get into a forum here, so I won't be too long, but the Assembly has moved forward on issues like early voting, and although the senator and I may have different views on it, we have been discussing it. You know, it is an issue that just won't go away. It's something that he and I have been talking about, and many people in this room have been talking about. Again, I think it's a tool that would encourage more people to vote. We don't know the facts yet because it hasn't happened yet. Of course, there is concerns about cost, and I think when we get serious about moving forward on it, we can figure out ways that we can cut costs to it, or maybe in the long run, it might help cut costs of election day. How much we spend on the current election day, we may be able to cut that down by early voting. These are things that are in discussion and something that I look forward to talking about. There are many ways we can encourage people to vote, but I think we have to give people opportunities. We have to give them options. In these days and these times now that we live in, we have to give people options to encourage them and get them excited about voting. So at this point, I'll hand it over.
We're going to go now to Dan Kolb. By design, we planned it this way, just to screw everybody up a little bit. He's the co-chair of the New York State Bar Association Special Committee on Voter Participation. Thanks, Dan.
The special committee was formed a little more than a year ago by Seymour James, who was then the president of the State Bar. And it was, his motivation was the reality that New York State voter participation is so abysmal. And let me just clarify something. We're not 46th, according to the last statistics. We're 48th. We've fallen behind Oklahoma. That is a sad reality. There was a time, and many years ago, when New York was on the cutting edge, but it isn't anymore by far. And so the question to us was, what could we recommend in terms of the changes in the law that might motivate voters to turn out? And the committee that Seymour formed was quite deliberately a balanced committee with 10 Republicans, 10 Democrats, and 1 independent. And it was a committee drawn from all over the state. And unlike gridlock that sometimes occurs in other places in the country, we found that everyone was able to work together and reach a consensus as to what we should recommend. And we've come forward with recommendations which I would say do not mean that we're against other important changes. For instance, when we recommend changes in the law, we're certainly at the same time not suggesting that it isn't good to encourage young people to be more involved or to take steps in the educational system to improve things. But there are changes in the law which could make a big difference. And where we decided we should put the emphasis, having entertained testimony from people from all different groups, was on registration. Because, and this is common sense, but certainly borne out, while only 59% of New York voters voted in the last presidential election, that is, not voters literally, but people who are citizens who could vote if they were registered, 89% of the people who were registered voted. The country has a record of 90% participation in presidential elections among those who are registered, and obviously those who aren't registered don't vote at all. The first recommendation we have come forward with, and which we honestly think is and should be a no-brainer, and is that the registration system should be put online, not just through the Department of Motor Vehicles, and the governor's already done that, and that's a very real step in the right direction, but also by allowing people who engage in transactions with other state agencies, not just the Department of Motor Vehicles, be able to register online when they sign up. A click would do it. They would still, as the system now requires, when you register by mail, have to go to the polls and provide a signature, a wet signature, when you first vote. But by doing what we're suggesting, you would permit people, anytime they interacted with government effectively, to be able to register, as so many do when they get their driver's licenses. Now, it's important in New York, especially because only 69% of the people in New York City, for example, have either driver's licenses or voter IDs. So there's a large number of people, as good as it is to be able to register at the DMV, who never interact with the DMV and so don't have that opportunity. Also, if we just allow online registration parallel to the registration which is now permitted by mail, it would make a huge difference. Among other things, the weakest registration figures are in the group 18 to 24, and in other states where online registration has been adopted, for instance, Arizona, registration jumped for that group from 29% to 53% in less than a year once they put it online, because obviously the younger population relates to being online. The other recommendations we made to improve registration were to pre-register 16 and 17-year-olds with special emphasis on the existing DMV registration system, so that when they come to sign up for their driver's licenses, they would have the opportunity to register right then and there. We also, and this is very much, I think, very important to the question of early voting, we recommended that although it would require a constitutional amendment, the state of New York should go to same-day or at least election day registration. Now, while the statistics do not show, we agree with this, that early voting all by itself will surely have an increase, create an increase in voter turnout, if you put it with same-day registration, so people can come in and register, including people who've moved within the state and have to re-register, you can then achieve a 6 to 8% increase in voter turnout just based on the statistics in the many states that have already done this. So you put those three things together, particularly focusing on the younger population, and we think you get a potentially very substantial improvement. The problem with same-day and election day registration is that under the law it requires a constitutional amendment. And so the way it works now is that the earliest, closest to the election day, that the laws can go is 10 days. We've recommended at least that happen. But to be able to do it on the day of election, same-day registration, you have to have a constitutional amendment. Everybody says, well, that makes it practically impossible. We did not take that as a reason not to strongly recommend this. We think that it would be something that could be done over time, should be done over time. Now, quickly, because I want to be sure to leave time for everybody else, we do think that improving the voter participation experience would have a very substantial impact over time on people's willingness to come to the polls. So, for instance, we do recommend early in-person voting, but we would strongly recommend that as soon as possible it be joined with same-day registration. 47 million people in the United States voted before Election Day in the last presidential election. 1/3 of the voters. Now, we take that as indicating people like it, and that it relieves problems. Now, is it the case that people couldn't possibly get to elections on Election Day? Of course not. But it obviously makes it easier for people, and we really don't think that it should be a trial for people to vote. We think it should be easier. With respect to the voting experience, too, we think it's already the case that we're moving towards changes in the ballot design, because the ballot has been a real problem as it's shifted over to the machines. That seems to be going forward. Among other things, improving the font size would make it easy to read the ballot, which is good. But most important thing in terms of experience at the polls is improving poll worker training and recruitment. There are a lot of good poll workers, but there are a lot of people who don't go to training, they're necessary anyway, so they don't really know what they're doing. And that means a bad experience for people. That often adds to the lines and so forth. We know the Board of Elections would like to improve that. They would like to, for instance, have a better training program, but they don't have enough money. And that brings me to the final recommendation, and I'll certainly turn it over to Tom, and he may appreciate this particular baton passing I'm going to do now. We need funding for these changes. Unfunded mandates are really illusory. You can't just tell the Board of Elections, improve your training and recruit better if they don't have the money to go out and do it. You can't, if you're going to have early voting and same-day registration, it is going to cost some money. Not a great deal of money compared to other things, but it's going to cost money. So our committee strongly recommends that funding be there. We appreciate that creates attention, obviously, but we think voting's worth it.
Tom Wilkie is the former executive director of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission and former executive director of the New York State Board of Elections.
Thank you, Susan. Senator, Assemblyman, Dan, thank you for the, because I'm going to pick up on a little where you left off at some point. It's good to be here this morning. I frankly think the board asked me to, the League of Women Voters asked me to do this some time ago because they couldn't find an election official who had been through so many major changes in election administration over the last 40 or 50 years, starting with the Civil Rights, the Voting Rights Act of '65 and the effect it had in the years after that. The 18-year-old vote, mail registration, the NVRA, the Help America Vote Act, and the MOVE Act. All of them in the last, say, 40-some years have brought major changes nationally to the conduct and the operation of elections throughout the country. Now, anybody who's ever worked with me knows we had discussions with me, knows that I'm a progressive. Many of the things that we will be discussing today, I have supported in the past and have worked closely with election jurisdictions around the country as they implemented some of these things. But I think that 40 years of working with county legislatures, the state legislatures, and both committees in the U.S. Congress has left me being somewhat of a realist. And that's a little about what I want to say first off. You know, one of the biggest lessons that I ever learned in my career came late in my career, and it came during the development of the Help America Vote Act. And I was very much involved at the national level on several different committees that studied everything that was going on there in the aftermath of Election 2000, and worked closely with the staffs of both the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives and with the principals involved in the fashioning of that legislation. And it took about 2 years of very, very intense deliberations and discussions. And during the course of that 2 years, that bill almost didn't pass. The discussion stopped. Everybody walked away from the table. Eventually, they came back based upon the prodding of the principals in that legislation, as well as the election community from around the country and the organizations that were supporting many of the aspects of that legislation. But through that, I learned that there are really 3 major essentials to putting together good election law legislation, or legislation really of any kind. One is dialogue. Dialogue is important. You have to stick to it. You have to be committed to it. You have to be ready to do the second thing, which is compromise. You're not always going to get what you want. And the art of compromise is something that, frankly, from my last couple of years working closely with both houses in Congress, just wasn't happening. And the third was having a healthy respect for philosophies, for political backgrounds, for positions. And this is, frankly, what I saw during the discussions in the Help America Vote Act. The four principles in that legislation, Senator McConnell, Senator Dodd, Congressman Steny Hoyer, Congressman Bob Ney, the one thing that kept those discussions going and the compromises made was the fact that they all respected one another. And it made a big difference. And I'm telling their staff, we're going to do this, you've got to find a way to get it done. And that's the art of crafting good legislation. Now, I'm realistic in another way, and Dan spoke about this a little bit, and that's the effect that election law legislation in general, be it either at the state level or at the federal level, has on our election boards, our election jurisdictions around the country. Our election boards are really stretched to the max at this point. As we look at budgets for county government, where principally and they are funded, you look at county governments now, they're trying to stay even budget-wise, or they're trying to make those cuts and deliver some property tax onto the people. And what do we see? We see what is typically, at least in my view, the election office getting the first one that gets the major hit. But yet, they're told they have to enact this piece of legislation or that piece of legislation. They've taken on, in the last 4 years, some of the most major changes in the history of the state here in New York, and that is the implementation of a new voting system. There isn't anything more demanding in an election office than doing that. So I think as we talk about changes which I have been involved in and supportive of, we also have to recognize the effect that it's going to have on our election community. And what I would like to see and hope to see during this period of, let's not call it stagnation, let's call it enlightenment, let's call it a brief stop on the road, that there is some more dialogue and some more feedback from the election community. Because we can throw out all kinds of statistics from all over the country, but unless we sit down with the election officials who have to implement this thing, find out how much it costs, find out how much it's going to take to operationally do it. You know, one of the issues that was brought up was early voting. Certainly made it much more convenient for voters. And I've seen early voting done all across the country, but I've also seen lines of people that stand for hours waiting to get into their polling place. Why? Because the election office was not consulted on any aspect of the implementation. How much was it going to cost? They couldn't afford to hire extra people. They couldn't afford to find the extra places for sites. So you got to, in my view, this legislation is well thought out, and I certainly congratulate the League of Women Voters and the Bar Association for a wonderful overview and study of all of these issues. I think they So,
Yeah, it did sound like a show.
The sign from God.
is that you, Susan?
No. Excuse me.
Susan has a bit of a cold, so I'm a little worried.
What we're going to do now is take some questions from the audience. While we get our ducks in a row here, I have one question, and Tom, I'm going to put this to you as sort of payback for that comment. Election reform shouldn't be partisan, but it does appear to be, and certainly from the anecdote that you shared, it is in reality as well. How would you characterize the different parties' view of this issue?
Depends on what the issue is, but again, my point in my remarks was that you should never not stop having dialogue. That's very important. And again, the art of compromise. Sometimes you have to give a little to get a little, and I think in negotiations of any kind, no matter what piece of legislation you're talking about, you have to have these three elements. Certainly, there are philosophical differences, and I recognize that, and I think a lot of people who live realistically and looking at this realize that there are differences of opinion across the board. You heard them from both the chairman of the Senate committee and the chairman of the Assembly committee articulate those views. What I would hope would happen, that the dialogue, and that's the reason I brought up the whole negotiation of the Help America Vote Act. That bill was dead so many times that we frankly thought it would never get anywhere. But it was through the dialogue, the compromise, and the respect that those four people, and they were politically scads apart from one another on those issues. But yet they managed to find a way to do it, to benefit the election community, the public, the voting citizens. And I think that from what I can see in the two individuals to my right, that I think that dialogue will continue and that they will get some input from the election community as they move along.
Does anybody else want to take a shot at that? And maybe my assumption is wrong. Maybe election reform is a partisan issue. I don't know.
No, I don't know that it's so much a partisan issue, and certainly I have a philosophy of, as I started out my opening comments, on getting people to register to vote, but also paying attention to and knowing what they're voting for. I think, I come from it maybe from maybe just because I'm more conservative by nature in areas of ways, but as Tom said, he's overseen more changes in the election processes in your career than probably anybody else. And change always comes with concerns. We see it everywhere. However, we're also constantly changing things without really giving enough time for things to settle in. We're only 2 elections, I think, into the new optical scanning ballots that really have thrown a lot of our more senior voters a curve in their ability to adapt to that new way of voting, and also, as was mentioned, ballot design, the ability of them to even clearly read the ballots because some of the font is so small. But I have concerns of constantly changing. We see it in other areas of government. A clear one to me is education. When we have No Child Left Behind, and then Race to the Top, and now Common Core, before any one of them ever got a chance to solidify, we're constantly changing things, and that's one of my concerns here. And I also have an overriding concern of the legitimacy of elections and making sure that those people voting are lawfully entitled to vote, which is some of the reasons I have concerns with same-day registration, as well as, and that kind of piggybacks onto our poll worker situation, our difficulty in finding poll workers, training them appropriately, and then thrusting upon them throughout dealing with this new equipment. Now, if we go into something with same-day registration, dealing with that all in the context of what could be a very busy election in these polling places. My wife is a former county election inspector, or election commissioner from Chemung County. She's not there any longer, but certainly funding is a major issue that they've grappled with over the years to be able to provide the appropriate training for poll workers. And now they've got the additional costs of the upkeep and programming of these new scanning machines, which has caused a greater burden and taken more resources away. I can tell you, she was the election commissioner in Chemung County only probably 4 or 5 years ago, and her salary was $16,000 a year. Part-time position. They had a full-time deputy that got paid a little better than that, but still not great. So there is issues with resources for sure.
Go ahead.
I commented on probably the least qualified. But, within our committee, We really did have the complete balance between Republicans and Democrats. And I wouldn't call it partisan so much as genuine differences of opinion on issues such as the senator just discussed. And for example, on early voting, we had a back and forth on whether early voting would actually improve voter turnout. And with same-day registration, it was pretty clear it would, and without, we couldn't be sure. We worked that through, and because of the cost factor, we came to a conclusion that we would recommend not the 19-day or 1-month period for early voting, but a shorter period, probably no more than a week. And we would cover a weekend, make sure that people who had other days off could be covered. And that produced, I think, a responsible compromise. It didn't cost as much, wouldn't, and at the same time, people were going to get the convenience to the extent we could give it to them. Now, we're not the legislature, but I think those views were respected on those issues, and that there's room for compromise and moving these issues forward. On registration online, that actually improves the security of the vote. If people are worried about fraud, it reduces that potential, makes it easier to move people from one district to another and so forth. So in terms of those who are interested in that issue, that one really worked for everybody.
Assemblyman Cusick, did you want to weigh in?
Yes, as Tom had mentioned too, there are issues that you can see a definite divide when it comes to partisan politics. But I think in the issues that we're discussing today in election law, I haven't really seen that definite divide, because of what a lot of the compromise has spoken about before. Tom's district, he still has Democrats that he represents, as I still have Republican constituents that I represent. So, in that sense, we're trying to provide the greater good for as many or all of our constituents that we can. And the issues, in most cases, and particularly today, are about encouraging people to vote, or in bumping up the number of people who actually participate in an election. And it boils down to the individual districts. Tom's district may be more Republican, so if you were increasing the number of people to vote, most likely it's going to be more Republicans. In other districts, it may be more Democrat, and that may increase the number of Democrats that already come out to vote. So I think I don't see the divide as much.
We have some folks who have microphones. We're going to just go around, raise your hand if you have questions, and we'll get to as many as we can.
Good morning. I'm Bill Cook. I'm the Legislative Director from New York State Association of Letter Carriers, and I participate with other directors around the other 49 states. We've long been interested in vote by mail, and we've been tracking this for a long time. There's a lot of data available in those states who do vote by mail. Data that addresses concerns about voter fraud, addresses concerns about whether or not there is a certain amount of regret over voting early, and you can certainly see through the voter participation and when they vote early whether or not that participation is changing over the course of time. We've been involved in this project for well over 10 years, and so there's a lot of data there. I would encourage New York State to think about moving ahead. As Daniel had said, that this piece of legislation does require multiple years of consideration before the Assembly and Senate, but it's no reason not to start and to think about it. In the meantime, though, as Tom had said, we're all realists and practical. In practical terms, the absentee ballot, there's a lot of laws that need to be changed there to make the absentee ballot more user-friendly for our voters. If you go to a polling place and you vote, you sign your name and you go in, and as long as you cast your ballot correctly, your vote counts. Unfortunately, with our absentee ballots, that's not the case. You actually are at risk of having to go through a test before a Supreme Court judge to determine whether or not your vote actually counts in this state. And around this region, there are a lot of elections that have occurred that way. And it's really discouraging to our voters to have to go through this, to have a register to vote when you're 20-something years old and then have your signature challenged because you're 80-something years old and you just can't get to the polling place anymore and your signature has changed. We have faith as a national union, being in every household and every business 6 days a week. We're fully embedded in our communities. And whether you're in a red state or a blue state, a conservative or liberal or Republican or Democrat or all parts in between, our citizens want to be engaged in our great democracy. However, in New York State, if we look at our voter participation, and this was a test, we are not passing.
I think that Tom Wilkie wanted to make some comments.
Yes, I am. I'm very gratified to see someone here from the United States Postal Service, because I think we tend to forget that they are an integral part of the whole election process. If you look at the statistics for mail registration, most of the people now register by mail. That means they're going to drop that in a mail slot somewhere and hope it gets to the County Board of Elections on time to get registered. And we have, frankly, 2 states now who are totally, in fact, there may be 3 that are totally mail now. And I know in talking with those election folks, they have to continually work on a weekly basis with their post offices all across their states to make sure that those ballots are getting out, they're getting back. And I certainly agree, and maybe I will make one pitch here. As someone who has voted absentee more than has voted in person, please do something with that ballot, because I'm getting older and I don't see as well as I used to. I'm one of those baby boomers that's now the new senior generation. And that's something that we have to recognize also. But when I open up that absentee ballot, I go, oh my God, this is awful. So if you could do something about that right away, I certainly would think that there'd be a lot of senior citizens across the state that would appreciate that. But I'm glad, again, that we recognize the fact that there is other people involved in this process. Certainly our poll work, we need to do a lot more in poll worker training. That costs money. And I will keep raising that issue and from time to time as we have this discussion. But thank you for being here.
My name is Patty Southworth, and I am a former town and county elected official. So I understand Senator O'Mara's concerns about the cost, and I definitely would say no changes if you're going to force the cost down to local municipalities. We can't afford it anymore. That procedure has to stop. I would encourage that absentee ballot regulations catch up with the electronic voter process we have now. If your ballot would pass through a voting machine, it should be counted. No matter what, if it would go through that machine and be counted, it needs to be counted even if it was an absentee ballot. That did not occur this year. The courts overruled a ballot in a local election, and it actually made a difference into the winner. The election was changed by 1 vote. The other thing I would say is, Senator O'Mara, I guess I'm questioning whether you could find any circumstance where this year you might see yourself voting for changes or endorsing changes to the absentee ballot process so that there's no excuses. You can register for an absentee ballot no matter what reason, because what I see is that especially single parent households are having difficulty getting out to vote. They are often working 1 or 2 jobs, and it's very difficult for them to get to vote, or for them to ask their employers, despite the rules, to have time off to vote. And I think those are the voters right now that are being disenfranchised a lot, solely because they have to have an acceptable excuse to vote absentee, and I don't think that's fair.
Well, I think we just a couple of years ago, we made some changes to that application. Michael, correct? Correct me if I'm wrong. It took, where you don't have to, I believe, specify your actual nature for your app for your inability to get there, but you have to just still swear that you're unable to get to the poll that day. So there has been some recent changes in that regard to open it up a little bit. I still think that there should be an obligation and a duty to go to the polls whenever possible, to participate on Election Day for that election. I think that leads to a more accurate election, and certainly whenever you're dealing with, and I have no concerns about the mail and the post office, as the gentleman talked about before, and I trust that the ballots will be delivered and get there on time. I have more concern with fraud issues or undue influence that can be utilized in the filling out of the ballot and putting it back in the mail throughout that process. And I think there's a reason for maybe some heightened review of those ballots when they're returned, because it's not in person, and making sure that any way the elections boards can, to assure that it is that voter that's casting that vote.
I think that happens at the polling booth as well, though. They bring people in with them. Sorry, I usually talk so loud, I don't need one of these. I think that happens at the polling booths now. People go in with a voter, and they go directly into that voting booth with the voter, and they're encouraging the vote the way they want. We see it all the time with some of our seniors, with people that are less literate. So I don't think that changes just by it being an absentee ballot.
I'm just going to chime in on this issue. But first, I'd like to thank the gentleman who represents the letter carriers, correct? It is important, a part of, and as Tom had mentioned, to realize we put it in a mail slot and we need people to deliver it. But I want to thank you too, because I know I get complaints from my mailman all the time around probably starting September and ending the day after Election Day of all the mail pieces that I put out, and I just wanted on record that I appreciate the delivery of those mail pieces, and I know how, yes, and I know how sometimes they get pretty heavy too. So I wanted to thank you for that. On the issue of the absentee ballot issue, you know, we do have legislation in our committee that would make it totally no excuses. Tom is correct. There were some technical changes that make it a little bit easier, but there is the belief in our House that it should be totally no excuse. You know, it's interesting though that this topic actually came up in debate for early voting. People brought it up as a possibility, as some folks used it as a substitute for early voting, but some folks used it as a supplement to early voting, is the use of no excuse absentee ballot. So it is something that we have in our committee and that we are seriously thinking about advancing.
John Banowski, I guess here as an interested citizen and a registered voter. So my question is mostly for the senator and assembly member. What do each of you see as the biggest challenge to enacting voting reform? And from the other person's perspective, what would you say is the biggest argument in favor? What would be the biggest argument you would use in favor of to a person that's in opposition?
Do you want to narrow it down to like early voting, or
Right.
do you have a specific element of election reform that you?
Well, I think, so I guess that would be the first part of the question. Is there a specific issue?
Well-
You know, would you define a specific issue as the biggest holdup? Or, yes, I think.
See, I'm glad that question was asked to clarify, because I think people do get confused about election reform. You know, what is election reform? And I think a lot of it is not just one issue. You know, a lot of folks would focus on one specific issue, but I think it's a combination of the issues that we're talking about today, whether it's early voting, whether it's absentee ballot redesign, whether it's fixing the look of the ballot, the actual ballot. These are things that will encourage, you know, and I think that's what reform is all about, is encourage more participation. You know, I think that's our goal here in this room, of everybody who's here, is we want to see more people voting. I would think, and I think I'd probably agree with Tom on this. I think the biggest hurdle is funding. You know, the issue for a lot of these reforms comes a price tag, and the official over here who just mentioned about if we're going to legislate something, it's hard sometimes to then provide the money to go along with that. And that, for me, I think has been the biggest hurdle for a lot of the initiatives that we want to push forward.
Obviously, I think, from my perspective, the strongest argument, even though you may be picking up that I'm more opposed to a lot of these things than the other members on the dais here, is that the benefit is certainly to open up voter involvement, registration, enrollment, and participation in the actual electoral process. But I have concerns, as Mike has raised, with the cost of some of these things in doing it, and with the potential for fraud. The more you get away from, I believe, from in-person showing up at the polls, the more exposure there is for undue influence to be involved in these things. I think an area of reform where we may be able to get some movement on is perhaps with the online registration that we've talked about. I don't really see an issue with, in this day and age, being able to do that with the requirements that were brought up by Dan, that online application is verified of that person the first time they come in and vote, and you get an actual real signature to match along with that. So we've had legislation in the Senate right now to open it up to other agencies, in particular the similar to the DMV and driver's licenses, to open it up so that when you get a fishing or hunting license, you would have the option of enrolling to vote, registering to vote at that time. And I think it would be, we'd be hard-pressed on our side to say it's okay to do it for sportsmen, but then not other governmental agencies that should possibly be open to, or at least give information out on how to register. It's not that burdensome to have to go online and fill it out yourself, or to even fill out a buff card and mail it in. I mean, that's not an undue burden, in my opinion, to require people to go through that process and to exercise their right with some responsibility, and making sure that they get it right and that they get properly registered, they get registered on time, and aren't just willy-nilly doing this last second.
But you are you would vote for online registration?
Yeah, depending on circumstances of how you go through a verification process in person at a point, before the vote. That would have to be, I think, at the election site the first time you go, because there wouldn't. Well, I don't know how that would work, Dan, with signature on, because you're not going to be sending an online signature in. I mean, I think that would be very complicated for individuals to have to figure out how to scan a signature in and get it as part of it for particularly older people. But so I think when you got to the polling place the first time, there'd be no signature in your poll
That
book.
would be the idea, and I suppose we'll get to a point where scanning the signatures would work, but we would just recommend doing it at the polling place. And
So that would be the first time that anybody in an official capacity would actually see your signature?
That's correct. And while I'm at it, too, if we do it the way we're talking about, doing it online, the evidence from the other states that have done this is that it is a very substantial cost saver. That, for instance, in Arizona, they had a difference of 80 cents per registration in favor of the efficiency of doing it. So it works for everybody.
In the efficiency and in the accuracy of the information,
Absolutely.
as you're taking your time putting it in for yourself, as opposed to a data entry person going through 1,000 of these and making mistakes on how they enter it into the computer.
Exactly.
Hi, good morning. I was just wondering, my name is Dylan Hayden, I'm an Empire State Fellow with the Governor's Office, and I was just wondering if we could get some comments from our elected officials about the need for more transparency in redistricting, because that's a process that we really only get a crack at once a decade, and I think that when we're talking about trying to encourage people to take part in the process, there are a lot of people who tend to feel that the deck may be stacked against them just by the virtue of the fact of where they live, and I think that in itself ends up driving a lot more of people away from the polls, because it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. They figure, if I'm a Democrat living in a very safe Republican area, there's no point in me even showing up to the polls. And I think that also challenges people's ability to organize and become more politically active as well. So I was wondering if you could both comment on that.
With the caveat that that deserves its own forum. We did do a forum, that's right, we did do the forum here.
Right, and it is that process politicized, without a doubt that it is, but I think any process you have is going to be politicized to a point, unless then maybe we start electing statewide representatives to just deal with the redistricting process every 10 years. And then you got to run elections to get those people involved. But whenever you're going to have something that, if it's going to be an independent commission, as talked about, those people still have to be appointed some fashion or another, and who's making those appointments, and that's a whole partisan process as well. I think redistricting has been, the issues on redistricting are as old as our Constitution and this country, that you know, people would like to say, let's get politics out of the whole thing, but politics is the basis of the whole thing too, I think. So I mean, it's a tough one.
Yeah, no, and I agree with what Tom is saying, is that because it's dealing with politics and politicians, even an independent board to do this would be political in its nature. The transparency issue, I think you bring up a good point, and I'm glad that you already have forums on this here at the Institute. But that goes to I think why people become discouraged and why they don't vote, is that there is a lack of transparency. This was my first, and I think Tom's also, our first go-around with redistricting as elected members of the legislature. You know, this was the first time that I was part of it, or it did affect me in my office, and so it was very interesting. But I do, if my memory is correct, I do remember that some of the districts that were in question were overlooked by an outside entity, and that there were districts that people thought would be drawn politically that turned out to be drawn what many people would think was the right way. It is an issue that the public needs to be educated on. I think that if you ask a number of constituents who are not involved in the electoral process, but they may vote or they may not vote, and that's the extent of how they get involved in the electoral process, they couldn't even tell you what redistricting was, you know, and I hear that all the time, because for example, this past election season, I now was campaigning in an area that, you know, I grew up in, and in the 10 years that I've been in office, it was the first time my mother could vote for me, which I assume she voted for me, but it was the first time that she could vote in the election that I was running. Let me clarify that. But the point is, thank God this isn't being televised. She'd be watching it. But the point to this is that when I would show up at that doorstep, right, in that neighborhood, people would be surprised to see me. And I would then have to explain to them, well, with redistricting, I am now your assembly member. And they would say, what's redistricting? So I think part of that transparency is that we, maybe as legislators, but maybe in conjunction with the advocates who are here, we need to educate people first on the word redistricting and let them know what it's all about and what it does.
That said, there's an absolute connection between what we're talking about here and redistricting, but we would take up many hours talking more about it, so.
My name is Linda Hunt, and I'm a member of the Albany County League of Women Voters. And I would kind of have a little a forenote, not an endnote or a footnote, but I know that there, at least in New York, is an Electronic Signatures Act. I don't have it in front of me, but would urge, urge consideration of the text of the act and of, if need be, of expanding, maybe changing that law to if needed, to permit electronic signatures for registration. But that being said, I kind of want to get to the issue of funding. And I was reading an article in the Times talking about the cost to New York of the way we run our primary system, our primary election system, compared with other states that have moved to a single primary system. And I'd like people, and maybe that the caveat here is that may also be a separate forum, but since we are talking about funding for these reforms, I'd like people to talk about that problem and that issue, and if that might be a way to address funding.
That's a great question, and I think right now, as it stands, we have multiple primaries. Tom, how much does it cost when, how much does it cost in aggravation when we have to have multiple primaries for a county board?
A great deal of aggravation, because that adds on to that level of burden that they have. If you look across the board to all of the work that they have to do throughout the year, and then they have to prepare for not only two primaries, but worrying about when it's going to occur and when petitions are going to go out, it adds another dimension to their workload. Not only that, in terms of you're going to have another election. You're going to send, you have to print more ballots. You're going to have to reprogram the machines twice instead of once for an additional primary. So certainly, from the perspective of the local election office, this adds another cost, adds another layer of time, staff time, and sometimes that's the most difficult piece of their budget to get is staff. Nobody wants to add people. Nobody recognizes that more than I do. I've certainly had my battles over the years just keeping staff level without getting caught. So this is another area. It certainly adds to the burdens that they have of getting those primaries and that election out on time. I like to say that election administration is the most unusual piece of county government, because if you work in the highway department, you can postpone building a road. If you work in the tax department, if the bills don't go out on time, they go out next week, that's fine. If you have other services that you can delay, you don't have the money, you can't do it, that's one thing. But that election better happen on time. And that means having a well-organized staff, a well-trained staff, enough staff, and the funding to have the ability to do that without making mistakes and getting it done on time.
Senator O'Mara, how many primaries are we having? I can't, and when is it? When are they? Do we know? Has that been determined yet?
Yeah, it's determined. The primary is the third Tuesday in June, which is, what is it this year, the 24th?
Okay.
And that's for the federal offices of Congress, and then the state primary will be traditional September, second Tuesday in September.
Thank you.
What?
I should have known that someone in here would know.
Whatever the actual around there.
But there was talk of,
Well, there's talk, and Mike and the Assembly have legislation to coincide the state primary with the federal primary in June, And we have, and I have legislation in the Senate to move that primary to the third Tuesday in August. And really, we all agree that it certainly takes more money to run another election. We have more of a political dispute over what we think is the more appropriate date for the primary. I happen to believe strongly that we should keep it as close to the traditional calendar that we've had in New York and still be able to comply with the Federal MOVE Act, which requires 45 days between to get the ballots out to our military and overseas voters, which is a problem, but we can do that in August. I don't think, if I had my druthers, I'd keep it the second Tuesday after the first Monday. In September, because I think that's a better time of year for that, and rather than having it either at the beginning of summer break for a lot of people or at the end of summer break for a lot of people, I think any time in June, July, or August is not really a desirable time. Now, the federal court decision that moved the federal primary to June leaves open the prerogative of the legislature to agree on a date as long as it complies with the MOVE Act for federal elections. One of the overriding concerns I have for the whole process is that we're mainly talking about two-year terms for congressional members, for every member of the state legislature, and to lengthen this political process into a time. Right now, this is our week of doing budget right now. Now, the Congress members are all out in their petition process right now. We've seen in the legislature 2 years ago when the dates were different, when members of the legislature ran for Congress, they were absent from their duties here in Albany, going about that. So it's disruptive to our legislative calendar, and I think having two-year terms, it's also disruptive to our doing business as legislators by lengthening the campaign season. And I think there's a lot of voter fatigue out there of the electorate. It's sick and tired of these elections that go on forever and ever, and by expanding the campaign season by another 3 months, in what are really two-year terms, it really cuts into the work that we do and really means that those of us in two-year offices campaign, 24/7, 24 months in a row, which is our job, and that's what we choose to do. But I think by having these longer campaigns, I don't think that increases voter participation or anything. I think it makes people tune out.
Yes, and if this were a presidential year, we'd have 4 elections in the 1 year. This is an issue that we need to address, and we need to address quickly. We are losing, I don't know, many numbers are thrown out there, whether it's $50 million that the state or the boards of elections spend because we have to have that extra primary. This is a matter of economics, saving money. It's a matter of encouraging voters, but it's also to cut down on, we talk about the necessity for encouraging qualified poll workers. This would cut down on the fatigue put on poll workers too. I mean, this year you're going to have our poll workers come in and work in June for the federal elections if you have a primary in your county. Then you have to have them come back in September if there's a primary in the states, and then you're going to have to have them come back again in November. So this is something that we really need to address and address quickly. I applaud Tom and the Senate for addressing it, and I understand the issues of when it should be, whether it's August or June or September, and the reasoning for the June primary for us, and we do have a bill that we actually have passed in the Assembly. It was the very first bill that we passed in the State Assembly this session. It was the first bill that we passed out of my committee this year because we knew we needed to address it quickly, and we needed to address it to talk about those points that I brought up. The issue of whether it's June, August, or September, I think we're all in agreement that it needs to be consolidated again, that we need to bring them all together. We have the June primary, quite frankly, because that's when the federal primary was designated. The federal judge did suggest a date back 2 years ago. It wasn't mandated, but did suggest a date, and that's the date that we went with so that we could have what then would have been 1 day of voting. We do realize that there are issues with the Senate and some of the members, and also members in our House, that they feel that if you have a June primary, it's in the midst of the session, it's in the midst of things that are going on, and as Tom talked about, the going and gathering petitions and going out and campaigning are all issues, but I believe they're issues we can work around. The session calendar is set by the leaderships of both houses. I don't know if in the past that the session has always been January to June. I know in Congress they have recess in order for folks to go and campaign for their elections. These are things that we can work about. Would I love to have everything back in September? Of course. But I think right now, today, that's not an option for us. You know, the options given to us as legislators to get it done for this election was the June primary in our eyes, you know, only because we felt that the federal process had already been started last year. You know, candidates were gearing up for campaigns for June of this year. To then move the federal primary again might have been, it would have been difficult for us. So we stuck with the June primary. We think for this year, the June primary was the best way to go. But that ship has sailed, I think, at this point, and we need to have serious discussions with the Senate to come up with, because there are issues with August for many of us. We don't know if that would drive down voter participation. You know, in a lot of districts, people go away in August. So this is, I'm glad that we have dates on the table that we can negotiate and talk about.
We have time for one more quick question.
I would just add on to that. I know we're running out of time, and I'm not one to usually prolong these things, Susan, but you know, why don't we include in the debate, if we're going to unify elections, village elections? I don't hear a big uproar about that. School elections. If we want to increase participation, maybe if we had more important elections on at the same time, we would have more of that done. And with I think you know, what's created this problem is the Federal MOVE Act. Why we, in this day and age, with electronics and the internet, why it takes 45 days to get a ballot overseas and back again. I mean, there's got to be a way to electronically at least get the ballot to the voter, and you certainly can get it back from anywhere in the world, I believe, in a shorter period of time than that, to do it.
Hi, I'm Linda Walzak from the League of Women Voters in Saratoga. First of all, I just want to quickly thank both of you gentlemen from the legislature as a woman, because I can go to sleep every night thanking that I live in the state of New York and I don't have to worry about my rights being violated as in other states like Texas or Alabama or any of the other states where women have to fight on a daily basis. So thank you, gentlemen, very, very, very much. We really appreciate it. Senator O'Meara, I'm just imploring you, before you make a final decision about early voting, to please spend some time in urban areas like Brooklyn and the Bronx to speak with voters in that area and talk to the low-wage earners about the burden that it places on them about trying to get the day off, because this does impact on their earnings. So weigh carefully all of the issues before you make your final decision. But the one question that I do have for you, I spent a lot of time going door to door in Saratoga in the last election cycle. And the one thing that struck me so, I mean, it was like a slap in the face when I was talking with voters in the district, was the fact that many voters had the impression that it didn't matter whether they voted or not, because it was just politics as usual.
We
And
just need to
there-
wrap up pretty quick, so
Okay.
what's your question?
They have a lack of confidence in the political process. And I was just wondering if any of you had any suggestions as how we could bolster up this process to implore the voter to get out and voice their opinion in the polling place.
Dan, do you want to take that?
Well, this is somewhat mechanical, and it doesn't quite address your concern about what people are thinking generally. But quite honestly, I come back to the fact that if you get them registered, they'd vote. And I frankly think if people are going to cast the vote, then they're going to be drawn to consider the issues. There's a much higher, the percentage of people who are registered who vote is very high. And I don't mean to belabor that single point, but in all honesty, I think that that's your best course. Any other way we can make government seem more attractive to people, everybody, I'm sure, would applaud, but that's a pretty straightforward way to do it. It may not be fully satisfactory to you, but I think it would help a lot.
Well, I think it had something to do with the level of corruption that's they've been seeing lately.
There are lots of things that,
Different forum.
yeah,
Thank you.
That's a week-long forum.
sure. Does government work all that? I mean, sure.
Just thank our panelists, Senator Tom O'Mara, Assemblyman Michael Cusick, Tom Wilkie, Dan Kolb. You guys have been terrific and a great audience as well. Thank you.